This is based on work I've done for a few years on apparel manufacturing in the UK. So we're shifting from a story of insourcing to one of near-sourcing. In relative terms, considerable part of apparel manufacturing has come back to the UK after decades of outsourcing. So that's quite an interesting case. And some of the material here draws also on research a colleague of mine did in Greater Manchester, whereas my data come from Leicester. Both are very important sourcing hubs in the UK. So both are within the top 3 regional sourcing hubs. The basic point really is that apparel manufacturing in the UK has grown considerably, but is economically and institutionally much worse off than it was before that growth has started. And that growth has started in 2008. So we have 10 years basically of that growth of near sourcing. 3 reasons in a way. One, there's a change in the value chain, the structure of the value chain towards fast fashion. Important was a quick response system, so whatever the brand source from the UK, they can have within the shop, within a week or 5 days sometimes. The second reason is that the UK has become a very permissive enforcement regime and a permissive enforcement environment. Labor inspections are very fragmented between different agencies, health and safety, wages, trading standards, other issues, right to work. They're all different agencies. All those agencies have suffered years of austerity and basically are unable to keep checks on the growing informal sector that has emerged. And the third, which I focus on a bit more at the end of this presentation, is that there's a bias that has occurred in the way actors and institutions have evolved in the industry. No, I'm not there yet. So I did say I need to provide a bit of context to the specificities of the value chain in the UK. So why is it attractive? I did say the quick response that brands get from close by manufacturers. An important feature is also that there are new types of lead firms. So supermarkets have their own clothing ranges, and online retailers have become very important. Now, how do online retailers work? The important thing is that they only have one shop, which is the internet. And it doesn't make sense for them to order a specific item in big quantities because they might not be able to sell it. So what they do, at least in the Leicester case or in the UK case, is that they order around 800 units, which even for small factories doesn't take long to produce. What factories do then is that they get into this constant rut of running for orders all the time, and there's in Leicester alone there are about 500 factories that do the same thing. There's always a factory that says I produce this item for 1 penny less per unit. So then the question is, how do they do it? Now, let me just quickly give you an example of how the pricing and the power dynamics work. So we got a dress that you can buy at one of those new star internet retailer companies in the UK, boohoo.com. The dress costs £7 in the shop. There's a story that Sarah O'Connor has researched. She's a journalist at the Financial Times. If you Google Financial Times, dark factories, Sarah O'Connor, you'll get the whole story, which is actually very well researched, I think. So this is a design sheet of one of the manufacturers. What they do is they look at all the seams and price them in seconds that it takes to sew, and then they add it up, give it a monetary value, and that's the price, that the cost price they come at, they arrive at. So the manufacturer priced the £7 dress at £5.75. They said that they would not be able to produce it less than £5.65. Now, normally, retailers charge 3 times the factory gate price, which means that in principle, or in theory at least, this dress should have been sold for almost £17. If we assume the conventional margins, the manufacturer would have been paid £2.33. Now we know that it's not been sold for £17. We're not sure what the manufacturers who actually produce this kind of dress, what they actually get. But it certainly is not $5.65. Now what do they do in terms of managing the labor force? So what has happened is garment workers do not have employment contracts. The average, the going rate is £3 an hour. There are people who work for less than that. Some skilled supervisor, experienced workers get more than £3 an hour, but that's still half or less than half the minimum wage. So it's obviously extremely problematic and exploitative. Workers do obviously not have any fixed working time. They live close by, they are called, or they go to the factory. If there are no orders, they go back. They don't work the same hours every day, they don't work the same hours every week, they don't work the same hours every month. So the money they get out is very uncertain and precarious as well. How do employers work it formally? Formally, workers are employed for a limited number of hours. So on official legal terms, 16 hours a week. They get pay slips for 16 hours a week, minimum wage, so everything is above board. But of course, they work hours much longer than the 16 hours a week. There have also been stories. Obviously, we have not been able to verify them at every point. There have been stories that workers got paid all their hours at minimum wage rate at the end of the week, but then on Monday had to pay back in cash to the employer a certain sum. So there are all sorts of different schemes to avoid this. So this is just a summary, basically, in terms of the official statistics that we can find. You can see that turnover, gross value added, has risen in the period 2008 to 2016. Employment has risen, but not in all regions. These are the 3 big sourcing regions. Employment costs have risen as well, but there are really no parallels between to what extent the number of employees rise and to what extent the real employment costs rise. The problem with these figures is that they are completely unreliable. The way the Office for National Statistics gathers data is based on these employment slips, on these pay slips, and we know that they are relatively worthless as a statistical basis. So this is not really something to put a lot of emphasis on. Interestingly, productivity has risen, but there's obviously different reasons for why productivity can rise. From the qualitative interviews that we did, and that's confirmed to Manchester, in Manchester as well, productivity might well have risen, but it's entirely due to the exploitation of the intensification of work, as well as the reduction of periods when workers don't work. Because essentially, as soon as the order stops, as soon as the order is fulfilled, workers are not employed anymore. They don't hang around for another hour when machines are reset, or when people wait for deliveries for materials or anything. That's dead time. It's unpaid. Now, there's a quote from a worker in Manchester. So they start at £2.50 to 3 hours, going up to 4 hours. Now, interestingly, to come to one of the themes of CRIMT and the conference, there has been a lot of institutional experimentation. So there has been a multi-stakeholder-led project in Leicester, where a lot of large high street retailers, together with NGOs and trade unions, have tried to change purchasing practices, change auditing practices, change compliance practices. But this has been led by retailers, by lead firms, and should have run through lead firms. And a lot of lead firms have concluded that they are not at risk, so they got out of the project. So in a way, it has fizzled out. There's a different type of project that has been quite important in Manchester, an alliance called the Alliance Project. Alliance is the major funder. So there's about £150 million that have been spent over 5 years, but the emphasis was on business-to-business relations and links, on capital investment and things like that. So nothing related to the workplace, labor management practices, worker voice, anything like that. There's been a partnership agreement between Tesco, one of the largest supermarket store chains, and a trade union. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't really come to much. The agreement was that the trade union would go with the social compliance auditors of Tesco and try to train and educate workers. I don't think this has been upscaled and basically sort of gone very far from a trial. There has been consolidation of labour market enforcement authorities, where the UK government has put in place a director of labour market enforcement. It's trying to link the tax authorities, the health and safety authorities, the border police, the gangmasters licensing authority, and Leicester has been designated a pilot project that's going on at the moment, so we'll have to see what's happening there. There was an interesting discussion I've been to where the city of Leicester tried to promote a one-stop shop for the fashion industry, and it was an interesting situation. A room bigger than this, where a lot of policy people and brand people have argued for a new glass and steel building in the city centre with a cafe and a nice reception area where designers and buyers could meet and establish links. Whereas on the other side and in the back of the room were the manufacturers and there's also an ethnic gap, because the buyers are all white British, the manufacturers are British Asians. And the manufacturers said, no, we want something in our community that trains the workers and actually helps our businesses. Well, they didn't get what they wanted. I'm not sure whether the glass and steel building will come, but it was an interesting clash to see that. Now, if we look at formal representation gaps, it's all very much tilted towards the top of the supply chain. So there's a new body that has merged, UK Fashion and Textile, that represents the lead firms, but manufacturers are not necessarily members of that. Much more powerful is the British Retail Consortium, which goes beyond fashion and garment industry. But they, even though they're focusing on lead firms again, are very powerful in the political discourse. Now, a new development is TMAL, which is the Textile Manufacturer Association of Leicester. So Leicester manufacturer have associated, said we don't have voice in everything, in all these things that are going on. We need to create an association. Now there's a political problem because the industry has been associated so much with well, wage theft and tax non-compliance problems, that TMAL, the employer representation, is essentially seen as a sort of corrupt body, and therefore it's very difficult for them to leverage any voice. Now, just to say, what it has done is power imbalances within the value chain have been, throughout all these initiatives, have been reproduced. There's a concentration in buying power. Brands, big brands, platform type, lead firms dominate the policy discourse. At the same time as at the manufacturer level, we have a decline of investment. 85% of companies have less than 20 employees, so there's not much power in the chain that anyone can exert. And in a sense, I'm coming back to what Pete Turnbull said in the plenary. If unions, if labor is to follow product markets, if product market institutions are actually hollowed out and sidelined, that creates a big problem in a way how to proceed and create institutional change in the industry, in the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you so much.